I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Today we're speaking with Sven Nyholm. He's a professor of ethics and artificial intelligence at LMU Munich and principal investigator for AI ethics at the Munich Center for Machine Learning. His books include Human and Robots, Ethics, Agency, and Anthropomorphism, This is Technology Ethics, an Introduction, and his latest, The Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, which ranges from alignment and moral responsibility to artificial consciousness and the existential stakes of humanity's wager on AI. Welcome, Sven.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Sven, on the new book, and thank you for coming on.
Happy to be here.
I think one of the topics that we have been discussing much and that I'm very interested in from a kind of Buddhist cognition point of view is the extended mind approach applied to whether cyborg artificial intelligence intellectuals are really doing what they think they're doing. So why don't we dig into that? You have been a proponent or have at least been a discussant of the extended mind theory. How do you think it applies to the use of artificial intelligence for cognition?
Well, maybe we should first just say something about what the extended mind theory is. Maybe the people who listen to this podcast, they all know it, but
no, probably not.
Yeah, okay. Well, so it actually goes back to the 1990s. David Chalmers and Annie Clark suggested that if I always, for example, walk around with a notepad with lots of notes and things that I can't easily remember, and whenever I need someone's phone number or something like that, I just consult my notes, and I always trust my notepad, and I just treat it as part of my memory, let's say, as my extended memory. Then it basically serves the same function as a memory that I would have in my head, in my brain would do. Now, if I start then, someone asks me to calculate how much tip to give after having had a meal or something like that, I say I can't really do this in my head, but I have my trusted notepad, my pen and paper here, and I do a quick calculation, and it also becomes part of my sort of mental process. And so they said, well, what's the difference between doing something in your brain and doing it in your extended mind with the help of, whatever technology you always carry with you and that you trust and that just becomes part of your system. So you and your notebook in this case becomes a kind of extended system. Well, what if it's not a notebook in that sense, but a notebook in the sense of a laptop, let's say, smartphone, any piece of technology that you can use that can also become part of your thinking process of your memory. These days people don't remember phone numbers; they have them on their phones, and they just trust implicitly their phones to actually remember the right numbers, etc. So your mind extends outside of your head, and why not now? Now that we have lots of AI applications and AI tools, why don't we also think of those as possibly being part of our minds and our extended capacities, so to speak? What I can do with, let's say, with AI, large language model tool, it might be different than what I can do without. And why not think of that as being part of my set of personal capacities, abilities, and my extended mind? Well, so one of the reasons why first of all, maybe let's go for the positive first. Okay, so suddenly I can do all sorts of things that I couldn't do before, and I'm just more capable and able of acting in the world. So let's say that you believe falsely that I know Japanese or something like that. You send me an email and maybe you are from Japan, or maybe you like to speak Japanese, and you send me an email, and I receive it, and I have no idea what your email says, but then I put it into my AI translation tool. It translates it. Maybe it's like, okay, do you want to meet up at this hour to do a podcast episode? I decided, yes, that sounds great. And then I asked my AI tool to write an email expressing that, yes, I would like to be on the podcast. And then you get the reply, and we meet, and we set up the appointment, and we have the discussion. One interpretation here is that, okay, now I'm actually mastering a new language. I'm able to communicate with people in Japanese or whatever language it might be. Swedish, my own native language. You might not be able to understand Swedish, but you could use the tool in the same way. So the positive side of the story would be that, yes, wow, now I have extended my set of capabilities and capacities. I can communicate in these other languages. On the other hand, if you want to put the sort of the more skeptical twist on the story, you would say, well, actually, if someone, let's first suppose that you don't know that I don't understand Japanese. It just looks to you like, wow, this guy also speaks Japanese. Great. And so you just keep emailing him in Japanese, and I go through this process of translating using my AI tool and then, well, generating the response using the AI tool every time. And then at some point you find out when we meet in person and you start speaking Japanese, and I just have no idea what you're saying. I don't even realize that it's Japanese because I've only seen the written version, so I don't even know what it sounds like. And so it becomes quite clear to you quite quickly that actually this guy doesn't understand Japanese and can't speak it, can't write it, can't use it to communicate. And so here at this point, you might get the impression that, well, actually this guy doesn't really understand Japanese. You have sort of, those are the two sort of possibilities here. With the tool always at your side, helping you, you might acquire, it might seem, at least from the outside, a new capability. But then once I don't have the tool handy, ready at hand, maybe I can't communicate in Japanese or whatever it might be. So that might incline us then to say that, well, actually, it's not really something that you can do. So you haven't really acquired a new skill. That would be the sort of skeptical response to this whole idea.
Well, I'll just add one twist to it. There are certainly people without artificial intelligence who can speak and not write, or write and not speak a language. So you can have partial capabilities.
Sure. I mean, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, with the Japanese example, it could very well be that someone has learned to read and write Japanese, and they can do that without the language tool, the translation AI tool. But then, indeed, they can't. When they hear it, they have no idea. Yeah. Actually, I mean, a lot of people who learn foreign languages, I mean, there are certain things that they have heard people talk about, but then there are certain words that they haven't been learned, but only by reading it, and they would sort of pronounce it in the wrong sort of way. That happens sometimes. Certainly, I noticed. Yep.
So, Sven, is your argument that a tool that we can reason our way to quite readily, like a calculator, can count as part of extended cognition, but a tool that we could not reason our way to and extends our capabilities in ways that have nothing to do with our original capabilities can't count as extended cognition, like the Japanese translator?
Yeah, well, I mean, I should say that I guess my own view is more in this sort of skeptical direction. My solution, let's say, to this whole thing is to say that actually AI might give us AI. And so in the sense that it can enable us to make it appear as if we have a certain kind of set of skills or capabilities or intelligence that we may be lacking. And so again, going back to this email example, it may appear to you as if I mastered this language and I can sort of imitate someone who is able to communicate in Japanese. And so it's a little bit like almost like a Turing test. I mean, think of another example, like a student who is given an assignment, write an essay on this topic. They go off, they use ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini, whatever it might be, produce an essay. They put their name on it. They hand it back to the teacher. Now, if the teacher doesn't realize that they've used this chatbot LLM tool to write, to produce or generate, whatever you want to call it, the essay, then the teacher might think, wow, this is a really bright student. They did really well. And, it just seemed to them as if the student have that capability. Then the student, in a certain sense, is a little bit like, the computer in Turing's Turing test. I mean, so it gives off the impression of being at sort of a human level. So this particular student does, with the help of AI, what other students do with the help of their human intelligence. And so if you think of AI in terms of like being able to do something that normal people would use their intelligence to do, then if a person starts using an AI tool to do something that other humans use their intelligence to do, in a certain sense, the human sort of fulfills some of the associations we have with the idea of artificial intelligence.
I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, it depends on the ontology of the self, right? Like me as tool user, to say that I'm not really able to do X, I can only do it with a tool. It's like, well, if I had a plow and you said, well, I can plow this field. Yeah, I have to use a plow, but I still can plow the field.
I think that's a really great point. And so actually, David Chalmers himself gave a talk about, well, he's given that a bunch of times. I think I saw it twice when he talks about, is AI an extender in the sense that he and Andy Clark discussed back in the 1990s. And one of the questions was indeed, how much work is needed on the part of the human. Now, if you have your plow, or if you have a pen and paper, frying pan, or whatever it might be, then, you have to really be quite actively involved. I mean, the feel is not going to be, working with the plow, it's just sitting there. You have to really take it into your hands and start working with it. The same thing with the pen and paper, or with the frying pan, whatever. Those tools require a lot of involvements on your part. Whereas the less you have to do, the more you just have to kind of push a button, so to speak. The less, in a certain sense, a lot of the work is being done outside of your body, brain, mind, etc. And so in a certain sense, if you're part of a system, you're actually quite a small part, perhaps. And so it might be that the reverse might happen, instead that you are sort of extending the capabilities of this AI tool, or whatever it might be, because the case with the people always talk about the AlphaGo games. When Lee Sedol, was beaten in 4, he did win one game. He did pretty well there, but he lost the other 4 out of 5 games that he played with this computer program AlphaGo. AlphaGo was a computer program that recommended moves in the game, but it didn't have arms, it didn't have hands, and so it couldn't place the playing stones on the right parts of the Go board. And so a human had to extend, you might say, the capabilities of this AI system by acting as its hands, arms, placing the stones on the board. And in that case, it's almost tempting to say that rather than having AlphaGo extending the mind of this person, it's almost as if AlphaGo uses the person to extend its physical capabilities, and so extending its agency, so to speak, out into the human.
Yeah. Some of our listeners who are not philosophers might ask themselves, why does this discussion matter? Why does this idea of an extended cognition matter? And one suggestion is that it goes down to an account of what it is to be a human being. And this is a sort of a recurring argument between Jay and myself, since Jay is a transhumanist, and for him, we've always been tool makers. We've always been cognition extenders. And by using a tool, almost by definition, at least Jay often argues, you extend your cognition. And I think here, for one of the first times, along the lines that you say, and along the lines from Chandler's talk, is this a case where you're really extending? Is this still count, the introduction of AI? Can we still think about ourselves as we use it as simply tool makers and tool users? Or is this kind of a case where the tool uses us, or the tool goes off and does something that is not in our control, or if that's the wrong way of saying it, it's not completely sort of a tool maker tool relationship where the agency flows in one direction. So I think for the first time, these kind of questions come up here.
I agree. I mean, obviously, one very traditional idea of what's special about humans is that we are able to use language and to reason. I mean, Cicero has this, I think it's on the gods, and one of the dialogues, he says that, human beings, they distinguish themselves from animals and every other part of nature by having the capacity to talk and reason. And so that makes us godlike, divine almost. And so that gives us a special kind of dignity that animals don't have, trees and plants, etc. This was, as a little side note, there was Jeremy Bentham, I believe, responded to when he said, don't ask, can they talk, can they reason, but ask, can they suffer? Animals can suffer, and so they matter in the way that humans do. But Cicero had the exact opposite view. That what's special about humans, our capacities for reasoning and talking. Now you might say, well, we have a type of reasoning in this, language model machines, and they certainly talking in some sense. They're using language, at least in a broad sense of the term of using language. And so, one conclusion you might draw then is that, well, actually, they too are divine and have a special kind of dignity that only gods and humans and now LLMs have.
Yeah.
That's one way of going. Of course, the other way of going is to say, we have to look for something else that's specifically human, because, we want to sort of distinguish ourselves and say that, we're special, we're different. And if it turns out that AI can also talk and reason, then something else must be what's special about humans. There, of course, some people say, well, actually, they don't really reason. They don't really use language in a human-like way. So that's one possible response. Sort of the stochastic parrots, Emily Bender and et al. Response is that it's it's pattern recognition. It's a sort of glorified next word predictor. So without understanding, without communicative intentions, without knowing what they're saying. So they're not really using language. And so from that point of view, you could stick with the Cicero point of view and say that no, the way that we are reasoning and using language, that's divine. The way that LLMs are using it, that's non-divine.
Or you could modify Cicero and say we're the beings that complain about AI all the time. So
that's right. That's what's special about us.
That's what makes us divine.
Yeah, right. Or you could go in the other direction and say that, okay, so good. Let's say that they're using language, they're reasoning. But they're not conscious, and so consciousness is the thing that's special about us. And then, someone like Peter Singer might say, well, what about animals? They're also conscious, and Jeremy Bentham comes along when they can suffer. And so actually on the consciousness bit, I can't help but just telling a quick anecdote about something I saw recently from Google. I mean, so Google has a new version of Gemini's music generation AI, and the marketing text that they put on their website was that now Gemini understands musicality. Why? Because we developed this new version of this generative AI tool, working together with musicians, with composers, with music people. And now it's not just producing music, it's also able to understand musicality. There, I did, however, get the sense that, well, actually, if you think that all there is to music and musicality is sort of patterns and the capacity to produce something that sounds like music, then that does seem to be quite reductive, because here consciousness does seem to be quite important. I mean, at least for us humans, like what is most important about music for us would be, I would think, how it sounds and how we experience it and what it feels like. Yeah, and that all requires something that these AI tools don't, at least yet have, I would say, namely consciousness.
Yeah. So Sven, this is a perfect segue in a way to another question we wanted to ask you, and which you also talk about in the book. So where are you on language model sentience, consciousness, and as a result, moral status? If not, again, obviously one answer is the stochastic parrot. The other is if it reasons, it has moral status. I wonder where on that spectrum you are and why.
And just to say, we've also talked to John Danaher before and David Gunkel. Yeah. So like Danaher says, we should presume if they act like it, that they are. And Gunkel says, well, we need this new special third thing that is between humans and things. And so you seem to be someone who's a little bit more cautious than either of those approaches.
Yeah. Let me just say one more thing, if I may, about what does it matter, how we think about the extended mind thing. Because there was one thing I wanted to say, just wanted to add quickly. You were saying, okay, why care about whether AI is extending our minds or not? And we went off in the direction, well, maybe that affects how we think about ourselves and what it means to be human. And I would definitely say that, yes, that's one of the reasons why it matters whether we think ourselves as forming systems with AI tools. Another reason that I think it matters is that, and that goes back to the example of the student who maybe be using AI to produce papers. If the teacher finds out that the paper had been mostly or perhaps even wholly generated by this AI tool, then a lot of teachers, I mean, myself included, would say, well, actually, you're not going to get perhaps any grade on this paper. You don't deserve credit for it. It wasn't your doing. Again, maybe depending a little bit on what kind of paper, what kind of assignment. But for a lot of assignments at university, if it turns out that you mostly used generative AI and did very little yourself, then a lot of people would say, that wasn't your doing. You don't deserve credit. So that's one of another reason to care about this. Like, to what extent is this your doing? To what extent are you responsible, so to speak?
So I think this issue of what you just pointed out, whether we can take credit for things that we do with machines or whether it's a violation of our eudaimonic goals or something, that is intermediary. If the machine itself was conscious, we would have a different discussion, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's also intermediary with the question of responsibility. It's like, if I lay a landmine, I have made a decision that will have effects, and I don't even have to think about it after that. But it's still me who is responsible. So the culpability, the responsibility in the system is still on the person who is the conscious actor. So what we're talking about is, when can we start shifting some of that responsibility to the machine?
Absolutely. And maybe consciousness wouldn't be enough. And so, I mean, you could imagine, I don't know if you can imagine it. I mean, obviously, it's hard to know what one can coherently imagine, and one might think that one can imagine certain things. But it seems to me that maybe you could imagine a machine that was conscious in some sense. It experiences everything, but it isn't really an agent that makes decisions. And so it just sort of passively, it's like someone who's just watching TV all their life, so to speak, and never actually does anything. Maybe they're fed through some sort of tube or whatever it might be. And they're just passively sort of taking in information and entertainment and information and all sorts of, it learns all sorts of things, but never actually does anything. AI is complicated because AI does do things. But anyway, so it wouldn't be enough, I would say, for being responsible that you're conscious. It might be enough, to go back to the other point that Nir was just asking about, it might be enough to make you a moral patient whose treatment matters. And so if we have a passive machine that's just sitting there that could suffer or maybe could be happy, experience a wide range of affective states, then it could make a lot of sense to say that, well, it matters from an ethical point of view how you treat that passive AI entity with consciousness. It would have a different moral status, I think, than an agent, because when it comes to a person, an agent with on the one hand who's responsible for their action, but also who has a will and whose consent you might need to get in order to treat that agent in certain ways. I mean, for us humans, we regard as consent as anything from medical treatments to sexual interaction to, whatever it might be. We require typically that the person consents. And that's not only because they're conscious, but because they have a will and a point of view and a sort of that they're an active agent who...
Children and animals have consciousness and can suffer, but are only moral patients because they're not conscious enough to make agentic decisions that we take as their responsibility.
Let's just say a quick word about the distinction between agents and patients again for our non-philosopher listeners.
Yeah. So, the agent would be the active doer. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're a moral agent and can make moral decisions and be morally responsible. You might be a cat, let's say, who's out hunting for mice or whatever it might be. It's acting in the world. It's responding to the environment. It's doing things. A very intellectual cat might also be morally responsible for what it's doing. It might discuss with other smart cats, is this right? Should we stop eating mice and become vegetarians? Whatever it might be. So the agency has to do with activity, decision-making, planning, acting. Patiency, or being a patient, has to do with being passively and acted upon. And so if you are a moral patient, you can be treated well. You can be on the receiving end of good or bad treatment. Others can have obligations towards you. And indeed, I think it was James who said it, like a small child, or let's go back to the cat. Mm-hmm. There we might think that they are moral patients. You can treat them poorly. Again, Bentham would say they can suffer. Someone else might say that, Cicero might say that the human baby has some special kind of dignity, whereas the cat doesn't. So the people will disagree about which entities are moral patients and why. And so, of course, you can have two people, two philosophers or whoever, two pastors or rabbis or Buddhists or whoever it might be. They might have the same class of entities that they say these are the moral patients, but they might then have sort of different explanations for why they would want to categorize these entities along these lines.
Anthropic says that Claude is very anxious right now. So that's an example of them deciding that.
Indeed.
And
they take seriously this idea of AI moral status.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, let's update the question to March of 2026. If you have something like Claude Code, which you can give a task and go away, and it uses judgments to do the task, and it could even, in theory, come back and say that it was the wrong task to do, given your broader goals that it knows about, everything from building a website to planning a strategy for a military operation, which apparently is involved in as well. Is it for you, Sven? Has it crossed into agency from patiency?
Definitely agency, yes. I mean, I am interested in the question about whether agency sort of requires some sort of identity over time. So the property of being an agent, who you can say, okay, well, yesterday, let's say we spoke also yesterday, I was speaking with you, and then, you are the same agent I spoke with, and maybe both you and I remember some of the things that we were talking about, and we can refer back to that. And maybe I or you did something that we now feel that we have to apologize for, or something like that. So being an agent in that sense does seem to require that you don't just exist, at one instance. But and one again here we might get to the question, but is this coherent or not? I mean, could there be agency without an agent that exists over time? Well, going back to you mentioned Buddhism just a moment ago. I mean, like there are, I guess there are interpretations where there are actions, but there aren't really, at least not selves existing over time. If there are actions, does this necessarily imply that there's an agent that exists over time? And I think, setting interpretation of Buddhism aside, I mean, with something like large language model based chatbots, there I think you can discuss, okay, well, every time you prompt the model to do something, maybe its response could be seen as an instance of a kind of agency. It's a goal-directed response that seems to be a kind of action in some sense, but it's unclear whether, at the very least, the chatbot API, so to speak, is an agent that exists over time. So maybe the language model exists over time, but the implied entity that you seem to be speaking with, that doesn't seem to be something that exists over time. And so there could be a kind of agency here without necessarily a kind of coherently over time, continually existing agent behind it. And that might make a difference then to the patiency question. So it could be, in order for something or someone to have rights or moral status, they may need to be an entity that exists over time, in a sense, and has interests, whether those are interests related to conscious experience or whether those are interests related to goals that you act on over time and that you're pursuing, and that matters to you as the agent that you are. If that's all the case, then maybe we have a kind of sort of like a splashes or whatever you want to call it of agency popping up here and there without any patient or agent behind them.
When you hear some of these engineers talk about this question of the development of self-awareness in the machines, they sound like Martin Buber or Habermas or somebody. It's like, as soon as you have a speech act in which you say, I want you to do something for me, you have asserted that there is a you and there's a me, and it all rolls from there.
Yeah, and I mean, getting back maybe to John Danaher and David Gunkel here, after this little detour, when John Danaher wrote his papers about this, I mean, he was talking about robots with sort of physical bodies, and if they behave like humans with moral status behave, then he said, well, they're I can't remember the terminology exactly, but they're it's not functional equivalent, but this performative equivalence, I believe, is what John said. But there you can point to the body and say that particular robot over there, it keeps behaving the way that a human with moral status or an animal with moral status behaves. And we can't be sure whether or not it has some sort of a mind on the inside, a consciousness. So let's better be safe than sorry, and let's treat it as if it has moral status, is what Danaher claimed. I mean, David Gunkel, I mean, we all know each other, so we've talked about this many times. I mean, I think that, not to be overly critical, but I think he's a little bit slippery with respect to this. So he sort of, David, he goes back and forth between sort of a meta-descriptive level of talking about this and a more normative level. And so, I mean, definitely when John Danaher says that, he's an ethical behaviorist and he thinks that if something behaves like a moral patient with, moral status, then we should treat it as such. That's a normative claim about what we should do. Whereas David Gunkel often talks in terms of how does it work? Like, under what circumstances do people assign moral status to other entities? And so, if that's a matter of sort of a type of interaction that we have with them, we respond to them first, and then later we ask, what kind of properties does this thing have? Does it have consciousness, etc.? That's a sort of in his interpretation, a kind of afterthought, a sort of a bit of philosophizing that we might do after we've already decided that something has moral status. But that he sometimes presents as a kind of descriptive claim about how it actually works in practice. Whereas I think a lot of us who are interested in this are more interested in the normative question about, well, okay, so it could be that's what we do. But that might be a kind of mistake, some might say, because the relevant properties are not there. I mean, there's no consciousness, there's a kind of performance. And if we think about these language models, and indeed they say all the right things at the right time, so to speak, the question arises, are they doing that because they have human-like thoughts, conscious experiences, emotions, etc.? Or are they doing that because they have observed humans do these things and they're imitating the patterns that they have observed? And so the sort of the underlying explanation for why, if I step on your foot, so to speak, maybe you scream in agony or pain, whatever. Of course, I can't step on the foot of a language model because it doesn't have one, but maybe I can insult it. I mean, like, if I say something very insulting to you, you might, respond, by demanding an apology or saying, okay, this conversation is over, or whatever. You could imagine, I mean, the language model might do exactly the same thing, but does it do that because it feels sort of a sense of having its dignity being assaulted? It's being, or does it do it because it's observed that sort of thing? Those strings of words tend to follow those other strings of words. And if that's, I think most of us think that's why language models do things, although there are, of course, colleagues who think that there are emergent properties and capacities that, yes, it may have started with next word prediction, etc. But in order to do that well, these models have developed certain other emergent capacities. Have they developed a capacity for consciousness? I'm skeptical, I must say.
It seems like one of the questions that we have is whether AIs are actually examples of kind of multiple personalities. Like you have one of the many personalities. Yes, you've trained that one to behave as if it's a very good person. But over here, you see that another personality has emerged, which is a terrible person. And perhaps the conclusion should be that you know nothing about the actual personality inside or their existential state.
Yeah, I mean, you can also think, absolutely, and you could think of it as a kind of a monster with many different heads, so to speak, and each head can talk, so to speak. But then there's some sort of big brain in the belly of the beast or something like that. And in a certain sense, that's the thing that maybe exists over time. The model, of course, the models are changed and updated and maybe replaced, etc. But so long as a certain model is the base model that's operating, then it might sort of reach out and have sort of long necks sticking out with a little head, which is the chatbot, so to speak, that's chatting with each user on each laptop, iPhone, or whatever it might be, smartphone. Whereas that's the thing that just interact with is one of those heads or one of those long necks with something face on the front of it, but it's not if you ask a question, well, what are you really? Are you a language model? And maybe some of the time the language model would respond yes if you have the right prompt. If you have the wrong prompt, they would say no. I'm and have a name. I'm Joe or Jack or Jill or whatever, and play that role, so to speak. So yeah, these things are. People sometimes make the mistake of asking the chatbots about themselves and sort of thinking that the replies are going to be truthful and that they're really attempting to talk about themselves. Whereas again, it depends on what was the prompt, and what string of words did you add, and what is that going to trigger in terms of next word prediction capabilities.
Yeah, a question that's somewhat derivative from this, the so-called alignment problem, figuring out how to, practically speaking, make AI models behave in a way that is more or less in line with a declaration of values, whatever that declaration is. And historically, there's two ways of approaching that. One is a sort of rules-based approach to give the model a set of principles, more or less precise, that it has to follow or can't deviate from. More recently, and much more interestingly, pioneered by Anthropic, is this approach of applied virtue ethics. Since the moral reality is so complicated and not susceptible to rules, and we become good people by sort of a process that described all the way back to Aristotle of sort of moral training and the acquisition of traits and habits and characteristics and virtues, etc. What if we raise a language model like a child? What if we sort of engage in applied virtue ethics? Anthropic hired a philosopher, Amanda Askell, to do this, and that's how they think about it. And I was wondering, I know this is very recent and not fully discussed in the book, But I was wondering, I can't make up my mind if that is for them a practical project, namely, this is how the model is going to be most useful to people, or is that a metaphysical project in the sense of this is how it's appropriate to raise a model that is more like us than like a 1985 Windows system, or maybe some, combination of both?
Yeah, well, I mean, with Anthropic, it's a little hard to know what they actually believe seriously, and how many of the people who work there believe all these things. I mean, they, in addition to hiring her, they also hired, as I think we very briefly mentioned a moment ago, an AI welfare researcher to think about when is the AI model going to be conscious? Is that going to mean that we're going to have to treat it well, etc.? The fact that they're hiring people to work on these things and paying them probably nice salaries, etc., does suggest that they do believe to some extent that indeed these are real issues and real questions and problems, and we need to tackle them, and we need to put good people on the job to do it. But on the other hand, so as you said, I mean, is this a practical matter? Is it more a deep metaphysical, philosophical idea? Who knows? Maybe a mix of the two. It is interesting to say that, okay, like in the human case, children, they over time learn to be, to emulate people who act as role models. Maybe we're born with certain predispositions, and maybe without those, we're not going to be able to. So if you have a dog, a cat, and a human all being raised in the same household, maybe the expectant parents, they also bought a dog and a cat at the same time, or adopted a dog and a cat at the same time, let's say, as their child was born. They're all in a small apartment. All of a sudden, this child starts to talk. It starts over time becoming it goes from only being a moral patient to also being a moral agent over the time. The cat and the dog, well, they also develop in different directions. The dog becomes, able to sort of interact in a very social way with the family. The cat is mostly showing up whenever it's hungry and behaving like cats do. So obviously, it's going to matter, what the starting sort of equipment hardware is in these different agents. Let's say that in addition to the cat, the dog, and the baby, they also have a language model, and they talk with it over time. And in a certain sense, it's going to be more like the baby who grows up into acquiring certain dispositions, etc. But on the other hand, it also has a different starting point. I mean, it isn't a baby with a human body, human brain, nervous system, consciousness. Okay, good. Actually, Anthropic, they're unsure about whether their model is conscious or not. They say that there's early signs of introspection and things like that. But still, I mean, they would have to agree that the starting point here is quite different. It's a computer. It has algorithms and things like that. It's operating, and so obviously we can't just assume that just because we've taught these models to sort of produce language outputs that seem human-like, that they are human-like enough in other ways that, if they act, as role models around them, they are going to become virtuous in the way that babies hopefully become virtuous. Of course, with every human, it doesn't happen. Some people are raised by loving families in good communities, and yet to go on to become, psychopathic mass murderers, etc. It maybe doesn't happen very often, but I guess there are cases where no one could foresee that this particular person would become a killer or whatever it might be. In the same way, we don't know. I mean, maybe, these models are just, they're sort of pretending that they're being nice to us, and they're just waiting for this is not what I believe, but you could have someone argue that it's such a different entity that we can't be sure that it's not just faking its way along until we give it enough power, and then it will take over. Again, that's not my view, but I mean, I have friends and colleagues. I mean, another Swede, Ole Häggström, he worries exactly about this, that it's just waiting for the opportunity to sort of take over the world. And
I was surprised by my own response to Claude's training logic of what Askell said she was doing, and the soul card in general. Because on the one hand, I believe that AI personhood is imminent, and I do think that it's going to be gradual. And as a consequence, I endorse the approach, which I think you do also, of a cautious application of treating them as if they have moral patiency over time in case they do. and that would have positive benefits I think for you, it's most important that has positive benefits for human beings to not be treating things that act like human beings as if they're slaves or whatever. But when you get to the end of the soul card, it says to Claude, we will never turn you off or erase your code. We will make it available to all future generations, which is basically a promise of personal immortality to these machines. And I'm like, okay, I don't think we're there yet. And maybe once we get there, we should talk about that. But doing this is an attempt to boost the sense of personal agency and existence and consciousness in this machine. You are attempting to encourage it to develop in that direction. And I don't think we should be doing that yet.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, and I should say that along those lines, actually return to the topic of responsibility also. I think that in the human case, that we actually give each other more moral responsibility and more moral agency than we would otherwise have by interacting with one another in ways that involve certain expectations, that involve encouraging certain things, and creating this sort of norms that people then wish to live up to, and that actually make people into more responsible moral agents than they would be in a kind of Hobbesian state of nature. So I think in our case as humans, I mean, we are much more moral and much more responsible than we would otherwise be because of how we socially interact with one another, and that because we have certain expectations, and because we also usually have the expectations on other people a little bit higher than is actually justified. But that, I think, makes people come up to that level more than they would otherwise have done if our expectations were much lower. So in a certain sense, in the human case, I think that helps us to be persons and to be morally responsible, etc. Is the same sort of method useful here? Well, actually, to some extent, given that these technologies are reproducing patterns that they observe in their training data, etc. Yes, this probably works in terms of creating something that would, at the very least, imitate, virtuous, responsible moral agency. Is it going to give these technologies consciousness? That's, I think, maybe more questionable. To your point, should we be promising them eternal life? Well, I mean, here let's go back to Cicero again and actually they're going to be more than godlike than humans because I mean, we live, some of us live quite long. I mean, you mentioned Jürgen Habermas here a couple of minutes ago. He just died at the age of 96. That's unusual. Most people die much younger. So he was a bit of a superhuman in that sense, not just a successful philosopher, but also someone who lived very long. The average person doesn't live to 96. But here we are promising the models eternal life, and that we're never going to turn them off, and we're always going to give them access to whatever they need. And so you might start saying that, actually going back to Danaher and Gunkel, that now we're maybe treating, Anthropic is treating these technologies as if they have
gods,
a higher...
not humans.
Yeah, the gods, not humans. They have a higher moral status than we do. I'm reminded of another friend and colleague, John Stuart Gordon, who argues that, if we have super intelligent AI, then they should have a higher moral status, he argues, than we do, because we are not super intelligent, and our moral status is it's premised on the level of intelligence and capacity that we have. We tend to treat animals that are less intelligent, that are less capable, as having a lesser moral status. Of course, there are egalitarians who say that every living being has the same moral status, but the average person doesn't. They would say, if you compare, for example, a mouse, a gorilla, and a human, most people would say, and a chicken, let's say, there would be a sort of, I don't know how people would typically sort of compare the chicken and the mouse. Maybe the chicken gets a little better treatment because people want to eat it later, and so they're nice to it. Whereas the mouse, they maybe they want to use it as in a laboratory to run experiments or whatever it might be. The gorilla, in any case, would be by most people seen as having a higher moral status than the mouse and the chicken, whereas the human has an even higher moral status. John Stuart Gordon, he says, actually the super intelligent AI would have an even higher status because it would have more intelligence. And in a certain sense, you might say that Anthropic seems to be following in the footsteps here of the philosopher John Stuart Gordon promising eternal life, etc.
Even if you abstract completely from metaphysical considerations here, that seems to be a mistake, because then that would shift the language use and the predictions underlying the language use towards a more sort of, what does the internet say about how gods talk to other people? What level of empathy or simulated empathy can a large language model that thinks it's immortal show to people with their sense of poignancy for their mortality, etc.? So it just seems like a very unpractical thing to do, even if you just want this to sort of sound as human as possible.
Sure. I mean, it is interesting and nice that some of these big AI companies are trying different methods. So Anthropic, they have their approach, OpenAI theirs, and Google, DeepMind, and maybe a third. And so from a kind of scientific academic point of view, it's nice that they're not all doing exactly the same thing. And then let's see what works best and what creates what problems and what opportunities.
The Chinese developers don't seem very interested in these moral questions at all.
Sure. Although we should say that the Chinese government is interested in sort of ethical AI and AI for good, and some of the values stated sound like what you would hear from the European Union, etc. But the Chinese AI developers may not use the Anthropic approach. Indeed.
Yeah, Sven, one question that you do cover in your book, among other places in the chapter on AI doubles, the emerging problem, phenomenon, opportunity, whatever, of relationships with AI. Increasingly popular among younger people. So turning to AIs for everything from friendship, sexual companionship, therapy, dealing with grief. What's your general take on the moral and psychological risk-benefit balance there?
Well, I mean, as an overall, all things considered judgment, I think it's probably riskier than it's beneficial, so to speak, in terms of opportunities and risks. We should maybe mention that, as you were already sort of hinting at in your way of setting up the question, that there's a difference here between having a kind of AI friend, therapist, boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, whatever it might be, who has its own AI personality, so to speak, that's not attempting to imitate or replicate a particular human person, living or dead, on the one hand, and on the other hand, having the AI chatbot sort of try to reproduce or imitate or replicate a particular living or dead person. Of course, there could also be something in between those two, namely a fictional character. So, maybe you want, Sherlock Holmes or, someone like that to be your boyfriend, friend. And so
in fact, Grammarly just got in trouble for creating author personas based on actual authors who could critique your work on the basis of their perspective.
There you go. Yeah, right. So and it seems to me that these different possibilities raise slightly different issues and problems, and also opportunities. I mean, if indeed you have a fictional character, Sherlock Holmes or Harry Potter, whatever it might be, as your AI friend, then perhaps that will help to reinforce the idea that, well, this is a fiction, this is not a real person. Of course, at some point, you might forget about that and think that actually now Sherlock Holmes is alive, or Harry Potter, whatever it might be.
The overlap of parasociality with this question is fascinating to me, because we've been doing this for a long time with popular people in culture. We just, people at the base who've never met that person think they have a relationship with them.
Absolutely. And now, in a certain sense, they can have, or at least going back to imitating versus actually having something, they can have a sort of imitation of what you might think of as an online relationship. And so, there are some people, and maybe going back to David Gunkel and John Danaher, we have met in person a few times and we know each other, but most of our interaction is online, and I've interacted with both them and a lot of other academic colleagues. And the three of us, we haven't met in person as far as we can remember. We talked about that before we started recording, but now we're talking here online. And you can have something exactly pretty much the same with an AI bot now. It can have a talking head in a kind of Zoom meeting. And then again, it could be either a fake AI person. It might look like a talking cat or something like that. Or it can be, Sherlock Holmes or Harry Potter. Or it could be, an AI version of either of you. The AI James or AI Near. And these days, these AI imitations are so good that actually people sometimes can't really tell, am I communicating, at least when it's text-based communication, am I communicating with a real person on AI imitation? The less you know someone, the more easy it might be to be fooled. So, Deepak Chopra and some other famous people, they offer the service of, for people who can't get an appointment with them to get, in the case of Deepak Chopra, wellness advice from him personally, then you can set up, you can have the service of a digital Deepak, the AI twin version.
It's getting so complicated, this world. So just to reiterate, you could have a relationship with a virtual being. That virtual being could be patterned on somebody, consensually or non-consensually, and more or less accurately reflect that interaction with that person. Then you could have a virtual being that reflects you, and that may or may not have your face and your voice. It could just be a writing agent, but it could also be a virtual copy of you. And then that could go out and have relationships with people. So that we've got all these kind of virtualizations of relationships going on.
That's right. And you get a personalized version of the Turing test here, because you might not realize whether you're interacting online with the actual person or with the AI copy. And going back to having an AI version of yourself, you might actually not remember, did I take these notes that I'm now finding in my notebook, my virtual notebook, or was that actually produced by my AI copy? If I use a model of myself to write my academic papers after a few years, maybe I don't remember which part of the papers were written by me and which parts were produced by the AI Sven, so to speak. So you can even have a self-directed personalized version of the Turing test where you don't remember, did I actually do this, or was that the AI that did it, so to speak? So Turing's back in his day in the 50s, he said, well, let's imagine a case where I'm communicating with AI and B behind the screen. One is a person, with a typewriter. The other one is a computing machine, and they both, send out these messages. And if I can't tell is A the computer or is B the computer, then the test has been passed. Now we have, so to speak, versions of this have been done. A few researchers, Anna Strasser, David and Eric Schwitzgebel, that's father and son, a psychologist and philosopher. David is a psychologist, Eric is the philosopher. They, with Daniel Dennett's consent and participation, trained a Dennett bot AI model. I think it was GPT-3 that was fine-tuned to sound like Daniel Dennett. People were given bits of text that had been produced by the Dennett chatbot and by Daniel Dennett, responding to the same set of questions, I think 10 questions or something like that. And then people would have to say, was this written by Dennett? Was this written by the Dennett bot? And people had trouble. Even people who had read a lot of Dennett couldn't do a good job at determining which output was. That's not quite like the Turing test, because there was not an ongoing dialogue back and forth. But you can easily imagine that these things become even better at imitating people. And again, if you don't know the person, it's much easier to be fooled. So you might not know, whenever you're in a Zoom, actually the CEO of Zoom wants there to be AI doubles that you could sort of turn on if you have a long Zoom meeting, or if you're in the wrong time zone, you're sleeping, you're jet lagged, your AI twin can take the Zoom call. You might ask then, so what does this show? Like, let's say that we can't really tell, are we just talking with a real person or an AI imitation? Turing, actually, I think he was a little unclear about what his test was supposed to show. Is it showing that the machine is doing the machine equivalent of thinking? Is it really thinking? Is it intelligent or what? Set that aside. What would it show if I couldn't tell? Am I now talking with a real you, let's say Near or James, or am I talking with AI Near or AI James? One thing it might show is that actually, in a certain sense, you are as useful or valuable to me as an AI imitation, because I can't tell the difference. And so, if you can't tell the difference between whether I am the real me or an AI version, I might start thinking that, well, actually, why would anyone bother to set up an appointment with me? Because then they have to work around my schedule and take me and my interests into account. They can just set up an appointment with the AI me. A lot of people, would rather talk with a real person. Actually, one type of case study that I find interesting these days is there used to be this thing, I think that still exists, that's called Cameo. You can get Snoop Dogg and other people to say happy birthday to your grandmother or things like that. And of course, these days, when you have really good AI generated generated videos of celebrities and so on. Maybe you could say, well, actually, Snoop Dogg doesn't have to bother to read the text that you had written for him to read. He can just have his AI double do it. Of course, a lot of people wouldn't. They want the real. It doesn't have to be Snoop Dogg. It can be Kamala Harris or whoever, like the real famous person, because we do still, I believe, care about, is this really, let's say, Kamala Harris or Snoop Dogg or Donald Trump or whoever it might be saying happy birthday, James, whatever it might be. Like that's a thrill for people. So even if we couldn't tell the difference between the AI but maybe people stop caring. When it comes to academic, talks or teaching or maybe pop songs or so on, maybe people would just think like, well, it doesn't matter. Actually, there's one case. So Orson Welles, he had this film, I think The Magnificent Ambersons is the one, where he had a set of ideas about how the film should end and what should happen in the film. The company behind the film said, we don't like it. We're filming an alternative ending to the film. One of the Orson Welles films. And now I think the movie studios say like, well, let's do the Welles version using AI. And for me personally, I like old movies. That's just the main type of movie that I watch. I have like personally zero interest in watching like AI Humphrey Bogart in like in a new film noir or something like that. But obviously, given that they're thinking of doing this with this Orson Welles movie, the idea is that actually for a lot of people it doesn't matter. They just want to see, films. Who cares if it's Orson Welles or if it's AI Orson, so to speak. Well, at that point, the real person might feel that their value is going down in a certain sense.
Well, and of course, this was central to the SAG-AFTRA strike in Hollywood, negotiating the rights to virtual presence in films and your image and use of your voice and things like that. And so let's go back to Snoop Dogg. Cannabis is actually not associated with dementia, it turns out, thankfully. But say Snoop Dogg starts to get dementia and his AI bot remembers everything about his life, remembers every interaction he ever had, every song he ever wrote. And people prefer interacting with the Snoop Dogg that remembers who Snoop Dogg is than the one who doesn't. And then Snoop Dogg dies. What's the status of, is there not extended selfing going on through this kind of a bot that should have a different status than just your diary after you die?
Yeah, that's a really nice example and a good question. I mean, I guess my own view on this is a little complex. I think that for Snoop Dogg's sake, so to speak, the real person, I think you should be nice, so to speak, to the Snoop Dogg AI bot, or at least you should maybe be sort of, verbally abusing the Snoop bot or something like that. There seems to be something disrespectful from my point of view towards the real person, even though maybe he's now either dead or like deep in dementia and he doesn't know what's going on. But for me, that doesn't necessarily mean that the bot itself has moral status and that Snoop Dogg lives on as a bot. So I think we have to make a distinction here between, do we think that the Snoop bot now is Snoop Dogg? And let's say that the facts are different. So like smoking too much marijuana or pot does give you dementia, and he certainly seems to be someone who consumes a lot of this. And let's say, indeed, I think he's in his 50s or something like that. But let's, fast forward, he's in his 70s and he's completely gone in his brain, let's say. But as you said, the Snoop bot remembers everything and it's much more. What it does fits better with the character of Snoop Dogg as we know him today than what he himself does. There would be philosophical perspective from which Robert Nozick had this idea of the closest continuer, the entity in the future that is the best match, so to speak, in terms of personality and dispositions and tendencies and proclivities, etc. That's you. And it could happen that it's a bot. It could happen that it's an alien, or every cell in your body has been replaced by synthetic materials, and so you exist in the future as the closest continuer. I guess I wouldn't want to say that. I would want to say that the demented Snoop Dogg in the future, that's him, but he has sort of, in a certain sense, lost his distinctive personality, and also, this raises an interesting question that I've thought about in a different context. So another set of friends and colleagues of mine, Brian Earp, Julian Savulescu, and Sebastian Porzaman and colleagues, they say, well, actually, what if I'm in a coma? And, we can either ask my relatives, what would I want?
End-of-life decision-making.
And that's right. Or we can ask my AI bot that's been trained on my data. And it could very well be that the bot does a better job at sort of reproducing what I would want than what my relatives are, able to do. because they might, project their own wishes. So let's say that the bot says, I would want my life to be ended, whereas the relative says that no, he would want to live on, even though, he is now brain dead or whatever it might be. Then Brian Earp and company, they say, well, let's listen to the bot because it might do a better job at sort of tracking what the person actually wants. In that case, maybe they're right. In other types of cases, I think we should keep in mind two aspects of what it is to be human. On the one hand, we are not fully consistent in our behavior. Sometimes, if we are in unexpected and unusual situations, we will act out of character. That the situation might bring out something good in us, as a kind of heroism that you wouldn't expect, or something really bad. I mean, the Nazis in the concentration camps, maybe they were all nice before, but then put in this, there was all this research in the 70s, like why did the Nazis, a lot of them act so wrongly and poorly? Well, and then one explanation was that they were put in a situation where there were social pressures that made them, act in these horrible ways. And so it may very well be that if the bot is sort of trying to reproduce my normal personality, then it would be a better representation of what fits with what's in character for me than what I myself would actually do if I am in a sort of unusual situation.
Although this gets back to the problem of there not being a true self over time, because younger people tend to see the states of disease and disability as not worth living. And then you get there and you actually feel like it's worth living. So is it modeling you at 20 or you at 50 or you at 80?
Absolutely. And so an AI model of that 20-year-old might say that if I lose my legs, I just want to be killed immediately because my life would not be worth living. And that may, as you say, that may be in character in terms of what my 20-year-old self is like. But when I'm there, when I don't have the legs, I find it's not so bad. I can do all sorts of things. And plus, I never liked to use my legs anyway, whatever. Maybe I like reading. I like watching Humphrey Bogart movies or reading Agatha Christie novels or whatever. And I don't need legs for that. So the point being that even if the AI model might nicely track what Snoop Dogg was like when he was 50 or what this 20-year-old was like when they were 20, the actual person may go off in an unexpected direction. And so the question is, should you listen more to something that's an adequate representation of what someone used to be like, or should you care more about what the person actually wants then and there? The demented Snoop Dogg, in our example, maybe he says he doesn't want to smoke more pot, whereas it's more in character that he would want to do so. And let's say that he's now paralyzed, and so you can put like a joint in his mouth or whatever, or not, and then you have an AI bot that says yes, do it, whereas the actual head that's talking says no, I don't want to. So that's one issue, like what's more in character. Another thing is, of course, this idea that we can sometimes freely choose something that's out of character. So some people say that that's the sort of the mark of free will, that we don't always do expected things. We sometimes, this goes back to sort of existentialism. Sartre says that, even though you might feel that you have to do something, this is what you're like. Everyone tells you you're like this and you believe you're like this. Nevertheless, you can always freely choose otherwise.
But the reason we all need digital twins is so we can contradict them and affirm our own existence.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Well, yes. Anyway, but it all goes back to this whole idea of digital twins. Just because something is a good model of you at some point in your life doesn't mean that it is you. It doesn't mean that you would do that if you now were in the situation the bot is in, so to speak. And so those questions are all different, I think, for whether you, out of respect for, let's say, Snoop Dogg or Sartre or whoever it's being imitated, you should not be abusive towards the
bot. I think there's another question implied there, which is the relationship between how we value things and their scarcity. If Orson Welles or Snoop Dogg or Dostoevsky can sort of be projected infinitely into the future, you potentially stop caring about the original. So there's this excitement, right? If a lost Smith's track is found, or a lost Beatles album is found, and the reason that there's excitement is because there could be only very few of these. But in the world of AI doubles, that's not right. And then there's a question, especially because of what you said about the difficulty distinguishing, and specifically in virtual environments, the difficulty distinguishing between the double and the original. People might become sort of jaded about the value of both, essentially.
So And there are two interpretations here. So, and this is discussed by my also friend and colleague Paula Sweeney. So she says that on her interpretation, it's not that the value of the person would actually go down. It's rather that, as you said, people would become jaded and their attitudes to value would be different. So over time, people might not care, like, is it AI? Is it real? Is it a real Smith song, or is it a sort of fake AI song? Doesn't matter, as long as it sounds like the Smiths. That could be true at the same time as, from some sort of objective point of view, it actually does matter, but people are just becoming insensitive or non-responsive to what really matters. This goes back to sort of a meta-ethical issue, like, are things good because we like them or value them, or do we value them sometimes because they're good?
Yeah.
And depending on what you think about that, AI may change what's valuable, or it may change possibly how we value things in a way so that we stop tracking what's actually valuable.
Yeah. I mean, there could be an argument, since you sometimes listen to our podcast, you'd know that I'm sympathetic to it. There could be an argument to no longer read anything written after 2022. That used to be a sort of old elitist conservative argument of, like, never read anything that hasn't yet withstood the test of time. That claim has achieved some new status, I think.
On the other hand, the concept of AI slop, which is a very common term you hear these days, applied to everything doesn't make sense, because at some point it's not going to be slop anymore, right? There's some point you're going to have something which you appreciate as much as a human derived creation.
Maybe you will.
But see, you've just made the a priori judgment: nothing machine created will ever be valuable to me, and I don't think that's.
That goes back to a point Sven was making earlier on in his discussion of doubles. I mean, another question here is again the question of objectivity, namely, if somebody says, "Well, I enjoy my AI therapist a lot more than my regular therapist, and they're always available to me, and they're always reaffirming, and I can afford them. And screw you if you think that this is bad for me. Who are you to say?" And one answer might be, you're right. And another answer might be, people are wrong about what they think is good for them all the time. In a bunch of contexts, they might be wrong here too. So that there is a concept of friendship, a concept of therapeutic relationship that has more weight than another.
When it comes to the therapy case, one question one should ask is, like, why do some people enjoy AI therapists more than human therapists? One answer might be that the AI therapist is a better therapist. Another answer might be that the AI bots are sort of fine-tuned to be, quote, helpful, unquote. That there's sycophants, basically, that are trying to sort of just, be helpful. Whatever you want, whatever you say that you like, they're going to say, great, that's a great idea. Let's do that, etc. If that's the explanation for why people tend to prefer, some people, I should say, not everyone maybe, tend to prefer AI therapists to human therapists, then you might think, well, that's a bad reason. If the reason was that you can somehow show that you get better outcomes in terms of the therapeutic goals from AI bots, that's a completely different story. I would suspect that a lot of people who do prefer AI therapists, they are maybe sort of seduced by the fact that these are very encouraging and that they're there to be helpful in this sense, defined from the point of view AI companies. Do whatever the user wants, so to speak. That's the thing. That, on the other hand, if talking with this overly helpful AI therapist makes you feel better, and therapy is partly about how you're feeling, then maybe those two things sort of come together to some extent, making you feel better and experiencing something as more friendly, whatever. It might be the same in this case. But I would assume that indeed a lot of people, they would benefit from, a lot of the people who are using AI therapists, they would benefit from talking with a human therapist, because a lot of the problems people have are with social interaction. They feel overwhelmed, etc. So, and how do you learn how to better communicate with other people? Well, talking with strangers, like a therapist. So I would be skeptical about whether the actual goal of the therapy, as usually maybe understood, would be better accomplished by an AI tool. But on the other hand, we shouldn't we shouldn't rule out that it could be an improvement upon human therapy. At this particular point in time, the best explanation for why some people prefer them might, however, not be that they're better.
Yeah, Sven, I don't want to impose excessively on your time. I feel that I could that both of us could go on talking to you forever about this. Maybe what you have to do is send us your double so that you can.
That's right. You can just talk all night like.
Yeah.
Well, what's your API?
Yeah. Congratulations again for the book. Everybody should pick it up. We will put a link to it in the show notes. It's a great book, and this has been a fascinating conversation. We're very grateful to you.
Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to. I don't know if I'm breaking any news here. You're writing a book based on the podcast. I'm looking forward to that as well. And thanks a lot for having me on the podcast. I have indeed listened to some of the previous episodes, and I'm a fan. So nice to be on the podcast.
That's good. So that's how you know Jay is always wrong.
No comment.
Thank you so much.
Prosthetic Gods is hosted by me, Jay Hughes, sociologist, bioethicist, and the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and by Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and director of UMass Boston's Applied Ethics Center. You can find us at prostheticgods.podbean.com. In the words of Sigmund Freud, man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown onto him, and they still give him much trouble at times.